I know we're not supposed to tell other people's stories, but I can't resist this one. I heard this from a very aged priest who has now gone to his heavenly reward, that when he was a young man, they would print the sermon topics in the newspaper. And so he was living in New York and didn't have a home church there, and so he looked in the paper to decide which church he was going to go to based on who had the best sermon topic. And he looked in the paper, and it said, it's Saturday, and it said, tomorrow's topic is fasting out of date. So we went to the church, and the preacher got on the pulpit and said, for those of you who have come because the newspaper said I was going to preach on is fasting out of date, I've chosen to preach on something else, but the answer is no. And then he went on to preach an entirely different sermon. But we're going to talk about why fasting is not out of date and why I believe we need it now more than ever. Now, Jesus was about to step into his public ministry for the first time. And having been baptized, he went out to the wilderness in the power of the Holy Spirit. He fasted for 40 days, bearing the temptations of the devil. He had no public profile, no disciples, no followers. No one knew who he was, aside from friends and family back home. And in the wilderness, he ate nothing, he taught nothing, he healed no one, but depended entirely on God through his fast. Now, if you have fasted, whether as a spiritual practice or as prep for a colonoscopy, you know it's hard. You constantly ask yourself, when is this going to be over? Maybe I should have just a little something. Maybe I've done this long enough now. And maybe you haven't experienced the devil showing up in such specific temptations as Jesus experienced, but you know the temptations are there. A fast is a time in which, among other things, we commit to stop satisfying our own appetites, and during that time, place our trust and dependence more fully on God. And to experience that in spite of our sensory experience of hunger, God can and will get us through, and we will come out the other side, and we will be just fine. Now, that is a profoundly countercultural experience and practice, so misunderstood, because we live in a culture that dedicates so much energy and so much value to the idea that if we have a need or a desire, we should satisfy it and do so as quickly as possible. If we hunger, we should eat whatever we want, and the restaurant or the grocery store will have hundreds of options for us. If we want something new to wear or to drive or to watch, it's all right there for us. Just go ahead and get it. Easy credit if you need it. It's never easy. Credit is never easy. If we don't know what it is we want, advertisements are there to tell us what we ought to want and explain all the reasons we ought to want it. And all of this is exponentially compounded by online ordering, same-day delivering, and digital streaming. Just click, and it will be there on your doorstep or on your screen. Fasting is a complete inversion of this understanding. It is a choice for a time to step away from the instantaneous satisfaction of our every desire, and in fact to step away from the satisfaction not just of things we want, but of something we need. And to be clear, while the season of Lent can be a great time to break a bad habit or cultivate a new habit, that's not fasting. The traditional fast from foods comes not because food is bad, but because, in fact, food is good and needful for us, and we return to it at Easter. Don't return to your bad habits at Easter, folks. In his fast in the wilderness, Jesus is preparing himself for his future, a ministry in which he's going to have to stay focused on his mission of teaching and ministering and being God's good news for his people. And Satan tempts him with the things that are going to tempt him in his ministry, to satisfy his own needs by magic powers, to turn away from his commitment to God, and to recklessly abuse God's care and concern for human life. But Jesus is not the only one who has been on a sojourn in the wilderness. In the lesson from Deuteronomy we heard this morning, we go back approximately 1,200 years to the plains of Moab, where the children of Israel stand ready to enter the promised land. Where Jesus has spent 40 days in the wilderness, here the children of Israel have spent 40 years in the wilderness, having come out of their slavery in Egypt through the Red Sea, dwelling in tents as nomads, feeling lost and unstable, learning through very difficult lessons how to trust in God, often wondering why they had even left Egypt at all. And now they stand there and they can look out across the Jordan River and they can see it. They can see their destination, the land that will be their home. And the words of this passage are from Moses, who is concluding his great discourse to the people. Soon Moses is going to die. He is an old man. He has led them the whole way. And the people will go on without Moses to enter the promised land. And he teaches them here to give thanks for the land and for the bounty that they will receive and grow there. Now, the first part of this act of thanksgiving is to take the first fruit of the harvest and offer it before the Lord in the tabernacle. Not just some convenient portion of the harvest, certainly not the excess crop that you might need, not the leftovers, but the first things harvested from the ground, whether grain or fruit. And a harvest gift of this kind also presumes that the people are settled people. It teaches them that their future is to have fields and crops and agriculture. So this act of thanksgiving will be not only for the fruitfulness of the harvest, but for the gift of the land itself. The second part of the thanksgiving is to tell the story, to remember not only the immediate past, I harvested this grain and its fruit just recently here, but also to look further back into the past and remember their ancestor Jacob, here named simply a wandering Aramean, and how Jacob's children came into Egypt, how they were enslaved by Pharaoh and liberated by God and brought to the present time and place, a land flowing with milk and honey. By telling the story, the people are there to remember that the fruit of the ground and their present abundance are from God's hand, not their own, and that God has generously guided and liberated and provided for them all along. That what we have and receive now is not new, but part of God's long-standing generosity and faith with us. It may sound a little bit familiar. It might sound a little bit like the way we worship when we gather for Mass. We make an offering of the wealth of our lives. Part of that offering is the bread and wine, the fruit of the earth, and the work of human hands. Part of that offering is our gifts of money, whether that might be great or small, according to what each of us has. And we then hear the story of God's faithfulness to us and to our ancestors, both in hearing the scriptures read and in the prayers offered over the bread and wine. So we have these three practices of faith to consider: the act of fasting, as Jesus did in the wilderness, and as we similarly do during Lent and perhaps at other times as well. The act of a thank offering of the harvest, as the children of Israel were taught by Moses, and our act of celebrating the Mass together. Now, I think the connection between thank offering and the Mass are clear in their relation, but the fast is related too. All of these practices come from and reinforce the experience of gratitude. Now, as I said before, we can have anything we want, anytime, any place. And wealth and circumstance can make that easier for some of us than for others, but nearly every one of us has the opportunity to make at least small choices to get what we want at some scale. We all have our favorite choices. We all have our favorite habits and pleasures. By fasting or abstaining from foods or other particular choices open to us, we acknowledge that it's not just the fact that we want something, but God's generosity that brings it into our lives. We give up our power to take and choose for a time, and it cultivates in us a thankfulness for the times when we do receive what we want, and especially what we need. Likewise, by giving up the first portion of the harvest, the children of Israel would acknowledge that the abundance of the land and its fruit wasn't just about natural processes or about human labor in planting or reaping. It was first and foremost about God's providence, about his generous giving to us of everything we need for our lives. In a society where anything is available at any time, there is great spiritual danger. The danger that none of it means anything. Everything becomes cheap, if not in dollars, then in spirit. Life is reduced to earning and spending, buying and using up and throwing away. In Psalm 39, we read these words, and I shiver every time I hear them or read them out. Lord, my lifetime is as nothing in your sight. We walk about like a shadow. We heap up riches and cannot tell who will gather them. Like a moth, you eat away all that is dear to us. Fasting and thanksgiving are so precious because they help us remember that our lives, our world, our food, our days and years are given to us by God himself. They help us remember that we are not meaningless. Our time and possessions are not meaningless. The strength and substance of our bodies are not meaningless, but precious gifts given in love. As we begin Lent, we encounter both the children of Israel and Jesus Christ on the threshold of their futures. The Israelites coming into their new land, Jesus coming into his new ministry as Messiah. And we are here at the threshold of this holy season with them. We are here to encounter the past of our ancestors, the life of our present day, and our future and its meaning. It is indeed right and a good and joyful thing always and everywhere, but especially here and especially today, to give thanks to the Lord our God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.